Sarah Martinez had dreamed of flying since she was 8 years old, watching fighter jets streak across the desert sky above her family's small ranch in Nevada. The thunderous roar of engines would make her heart race, and she would stand on the wooden fence, arms spread wide like wings, imagining herself in the cockpit. Her father would laugh and ruffle her dark hair, telling her that little girls didn't become fighter pilots. But Sarah wasn't listening to limitations. 20 years later, she stood at the gates of Nellis Air Force Base, her acceptance letter crumpled in her sweaty palm. The letter had arrived 3 months ago, and she had read it so many times the paper was beginning to tear at the folds. After 4 years at the Air Force Academy, 2 years of initial flight training, and countless hours of preparation, she was finally here. The Advanced Fighter Training Program. The last step before becoming a real fighter pilot. The security guard looked at her with mild surprise. "You sure you're in the right place, miss?" he asked, his weathered face creasing into what might have been a smile or a smirk. Sarah handed him her identification and orders, trying to keep her expression neutral. She had learned early in her military career that showing any emotion other than calm confidence was seen as weakness. "First day?" the guard asked, looking at her paperwork. "You know what you're getting into here?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, sir." The guard shook his head slowly. "Well, good luck. You're gonna need it." As she walked through the gates, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, Sarah could feel eyes following her. The base was buzzing with activity. And everywhere she looked, she saw pilots in flight suits, ground crew working on aircraft, and the occasional roar of a jet taking off. This was exactly where she wanted to be, but the weight of being different pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. The bachelor officer quarters, where she would be staying for the next 6 months, were surprisingly quiet when she arrived. Her room was small and spartanly furnished, just a bed, desk, and small closet. She unpacked methodically, hanging her uniforms with military precision and placing her few personal items on the desk. A photo of her parents, a small American flag her grandmother had given her, and a model F-22 Raptor she had built in high school. At exactly 0600 hours the next morning, Sarah stood with 11 other pilots in the briefing room. She was the only woman. The men ranged in age from 24 to 30, all graduates of various flight training programs, all here for the same reason she was, to learn to fly the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. Colonel James Harrison entered the room with the bearing of a man who had seen combat and lived to tell about it. His steel-gray hair was cut regulation short, and his blue eyes seemed to take in every detail of the assembled group. When his gaze fell on Sarah, it lingered for just a moment longer than on the others. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Welcome to hell. For the next 6 months, we are going to push you to your absolute limits and beyond. Some of you will wash out, some of you will quit. And some of you will discover that you have what it takes to fly the F-22 Raptor in combat." He began to pace in front of the group, his hands clasped behind his back. "This aircraft represents the pinnacle of American air superiority. It is faster, more maneuverable, and more lethal than anything else in the sky. But it is also unforgiving. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, one lapse in judgment, and you will find yourself in a very expensive smoking hole in the ground." Sarah listened intently, her notebook open, pen poised to capture every detail. She had prepared for this moment her entire adult life, and she wasn't going to let anything slip by. "The F-22 requires absolute precision," Colonel Harrison continued. "It requires split-second decision-making under extreme stress. It requires the ability to think in 3 dimensions while pulling 9 Gs and maintaining situational awareness of multiple threats. Not everyone is cut out for this kind of flying." Again, his eyes found Sarah in the group. "Some people simply don't have the physical or mental capabilities required to master this aircraft. There is no shame in recognizing your limitations early and finding a different path in the Air Force. After the briefing, as the group filed out, Sarah heard whispers behind her. "I give her 2 weeks," one voice said quietly. "Maybe 3 if she's lucky," came the reply. She kept walking, her spine straight, her face impassive. She had heard it all before. The first few days were a blur of classroom instruction, physical fitness tests, and psychological evaluations. Sarah threw herself into every aspect of the training with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. Her study materials were covered with notes, diagrams, and calculations. She memorized aircraft specifications, emergency procedures, and combat tactics until she could recite them in her sleep. But it wasn't enough for some of her instructors. Captain Derek Morrison, her flight instructor for basic maneuvers, made his opinions clear from the first day. He was a 20-year veteran with over 3,000 hours in fighter aircraft, and he had never trained a female pilot before. He made sure everyone knew it. "Miss Martinez," he would say during debriefings, emphasizing the miss in a way that made it sound like an insult. "Your stick inputs are too aggressive. You're over-controlling the aircraft. Maybe you should consider something more suitable to your abilities. Transport aircraft, perhaps. Or maybe a desk job." Sarah would nod and take notes, filing away his criticism and working twice as hard to correct whatever issues he had identified. But no matter how much she improved, Captain Morrison always found something wrong. Her turns weren't crisp enough. Her altitude control wasn't precise enough. Her radio communications weren't authoritative enough. The other pilots in her class began to notice the disparity in treatment. During a break between flights, Lieutenant Mike Chen approached her near the flight line. "He's being harder on you than the rest of us," Mike said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "We all know it." Sarah appreciated the support, but she also knew that acknowledging the unfair treatment would only make her look weak. "I can handle it," she replied simply. "Yeah, but it's not right," Mike pressed. "You're flying better than half the guys in the class, and he's treating you like you don't belong here." Sarah looked out at the row of F-22s parked on the flight line, their angular shapes gleaming in the Nevada sun. Each aircraft cost over $150 million and represented the cutting edge of military technology. She had dreamed of flying them for so long that the sight still took her breath away. "Maybe I don't belong here," she said quietly. "Maybe they're right." Mike shook his head firmly. "Don't let them get in your head. You earned your place here just like the rest of us. Don't let anyone tell you different." The physical demands of the training were unlike anything Sarah had experienced before. The G-force training was particularly brutal. Strapped into a centrifuge that spun at tremendous speeds, the pilots experienced the crushing force that they would encounter during high-speed maneuvers in the F-22. Most people couldn't handle more than 7 or 8 Gs without losing consciousness. Fighter pilots needed to be able to function at 9 Gs or higher. Sarah's first time in the centrifuge was a disaster. At 6 Gs, her vision began to tunnel. At 7, she felt like an elephant was sitting on her chest. At 8, everything went black. She came to with an instructor standing over her, shaking his head. "Maybe you should reconsider your career choices," he said, making a note on his clipboard. That night, Sarah researched G-force conditioning techniques until her eyes burned. She learned about breathing exercises, muscle tension techniques, and mental preparation strategies. She practiced for hours in her room, tensing and releasing different muscle groups, learning to control her breathing under stress. The next week, she made it to 9 Gs before blacking out. The week after that, 9.5. The instructor seemed almost disappointed that she was improving. The academic portion of the training was equally demanding. The F-22's systems were incredibly complex, with multiple redundant safety features, advanced radar and targeting systems, and electronic warfare capabilities that bordered on science fiction. The pilots needed to understand every system intimately, not just how to use them, but how they worked and what to do when they failed. Sarah excelled in the classroom. She had always been a good student, but here she pushed herself to be exceptional. She could draw detailed diagrams of the aircraft's flight control systems from memory. She could calculate fuel consumption rates and range limitations in her head. She knew the radar cross-section of every potential enemy aircraft and their engagement envelopes. But even her academic success was dismissed by some instructors. "Book smart doesn't make you air smart," Captain Morrison would say. "Flying is about instinct, not memorization. Some people have it and some people don't." The first time Sarah actually flew an F-22 was both the most terrifying and most exhilarating experience of her life. The aircraft was unlike anything she had ever flown before. The thrust-to-weight ratio was so high that acceleration felt like being shot from a cannon. The flight controls were so sensitive that the slightest input would send the aircraft into a steep climb or diving turn. Captain Morrison was in the back seat for her first flight, monitoring her every move and providing constant criticism through the intercom. "You're behind the aircraft, Martinez. Anticipate, don't react. This isn't a trainer aircraft. It won't forgive sloppy flying." Despite the constant negativity, Sarah felt something click during that first flight. The F-22 was demanding, yes, but it was also incredibly responsive. Once she learned to trust the aircraft and make smaller, more precise inputs, it began to feel like an extension of herself. By the end of the flight, she was performing basic maneuvers with growing confidence. "Better," Captain Morrison admitted grudgingly during the debrief, "but you're still not thinking like a fighter pilot. You're thinking like someone playing a video game." The weeks passed in a blur of flights, classroom instruction, and physical training. Sarah's skills improved steadily, but so did the pressure. Some of the other pilots had already washed out of the program, unable to handle the stress or the complexity of the aircraft. The remaining group was getting smaller, and the competition more intense. During a particularly challenging formation flying exercise, one of Sarah's classmates made a critical error that nearly resulted in a mid-air collision. The pilot, Lieutenant Brad Stevens, had been struggling with the program for weeks and seemed increasingly frustrated with his performance. After the near miss, he was immediately grounded pending a safety review. That evening, Stevens approached Sarah in the dining facility. He looked exhausted and defeated, his usually perfect uniform wrinkled and his hair disheveled. "I'm done," he said, slumping into the chair across from her. "They're washing me out tomorrow." Sarah felt a mixture of sympathy and relief. Sympathy because she knew how much this meant to all of them, and relief because one less competitor meant better odds for her own success. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Stevens laughed bitterly. "You know what really gets me? They're keeping you and washing me out. A woman who probably can't even reach the rudder pedals is going to fly F-22s while I go back to flying cargo planes." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice level. "Maybe they're keeping me because I'm a better pilot." "Right," Stevens said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or maybe they need to meet some kind of quota. Can't have an all-male fighter squadron in today's military." The implication hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Sarah had heard variations of this accusation throughout her military career, but it never got easier. The suggestion that her achievements were due to special treatment rather than merit was particularly galling because she had always held herself to higher standards than everyone around her. "I've earned everything I've gotten," she said quietly, her hands clenched into fists under the table. Stevens stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Whatever helps you sleep at night, Martinez. Just remember that when you're flying combat missions, the enemy isn't going to care about political correctness. They're going to try to kill you, and your weaknesses are going to get other people killed too." As he walked away, Sarah felt the familiar burning sensation in her chest that came with suppressed anger and frustration. She had worked twice as hard as anyone else to get here, sacrificed more, endured more criticism, and overcome more obstacles. Yet people like Stevens would always believe that her success was somehow undeserved. The remaining weeks of the program passed quickly. Sarah's flying improved dramatically, and even Captain Morrison began to acknowledge her progress grudgingly. She mastered the complex air-to-air combat scenarios, learned to employ the F-22's advanced weapons systems, and demonstrated the split-second decision-making that separated fighter pilots from everyone else. But as graduation approached, Sarah realized that proving herself in the training program was only the beginning. The real test would come when she was assigned to an operational squadron, flying real missions with real consequences. And based on the attitudes she had encountered so far, she suspected that the challenges were just getting started. The night before graduation, Sarah stood on the flight line looking at the F-22s parked in neat rows. In a few hours, she would officially be qualified to fly these incredible machines in combat. She had achieved her childhood dream despite all the obstacles and doubts, but instead of feeling triumphant, she felt apprehensive about what lay ahead. Tomorrow, she would find out where she would be stationed and which squadron would become her new home. She hoped for a unit where she would be judged solely on her abilities as a pilot, but she wasn't naive enough to expect it. The real fight was just beginning. Sarah's assignment orders came through 3 days after graduation. She was being sent to the 1st Fighter Wing at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, one of the premier F-22 units in the Air Force. It should have been a dream assignment, but Sarah felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach as she read the details. The 1st Fighter Wing had a reputation for excellence, but it also had a reputation for being an old boys' club where tradition and conformity were valued above all else. The cross-country flight to Virginia gave her time to think. As she watched the landscape pass beneath the transport aircraft, Sarah reflected on everything that had brought her to this moment. She thought about her father, who had passed away during her 2nd year at the academy, and how proud he would have been to see her graduate from fighter training. She thought about all the instructors who had doubted her, the classmates who had dismissed her, and the constant pressure to prove herself over and over again. Langley Air Force Base was impressive even by military standards. The facilities were state-of-the-art, the aircraft were immaculate, and everything ran with clockwork precision. Sarah checked into the base and found her way to the 94th Fighter Squadron, where she would be spending the next few years of her life. The squadron building was a study in Air Force tradition. The walls were lined with photographs of previous squadron commanders, displays of awards and commendations, and models of the various aircraft the unit had flown over the decades. Sarah paused in front of a particularly impressive display case filled with medals and ribbons earned in combat over Iraq and Afghanistan. "Impressive, isn't it?" a voice said behind her. Sarah turned to see a tall, lean man with colonel's eagles on his collar. He had the weathered look of someone who had spent years in fighter cockpits with sharp eyes and graying hair that was perfectly regulation. "Colonel Peterson," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "I'm the squadron commander. You must be Lieutenant Martinez." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, shaking his hand firmly. Colonel Peterson studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I've read your training reports. Impressive scores, particularly in air-to-air combat scenarios. Captain Morrison had some interesting comments about your flying." Sarah tensed, waiting for whatever criticism Captain Morrison had passed along. "He said you're one of the most naturally aggressive pilots he's ever trained," Colonel Peterson continued. "High praise coming from him. He doesn't give compliments lightly." This was news to Sarah. Captain Morrison had never said anything positive to her directly during the entire training program. "However," Colonel Peterson continued, and Sarah felt her heart sink, "this squadron operates differently than the training environment. Here, we're a team. We depend on each other in ways that you can't fully understand until you've been in combat. Trust is everything, and trust is earned over time. Sarah nodded, understanding the subtext. She would need to prove herself all over again. "I'm assigning you to B Flight," the colonel said. "Major Tom Bradley is the flight commander. He's one of our most experienced pilots, and he'll help you transition from training to operational flying. Don't disappoint me, Lieutenant." Major Bradley turned out to be a compact, energetic man in his early 30s who seemed to view everything as a competition. He had over 500 hours in the F-22 and had flown combat missions over Syria. When Sarah reported to him that afternoon, he was studying mission planning materials at his desk, surrounded by charts and intelligence reports. "So you're our new pilot," he said without looking up. "I've heard interesting things about you." "Good things, I hope." "Sir," Sarah replied. Bradley finally looked up, his brown eyes appraising her critically. "That remains to be seen. Training is one thing. Flying operationally is something else entirely. In training, if you screw up, you get a bad grade. Out here, if you screw up, people die." Over the next several weeks, Sarah threw herself into learning the squadron's operating procedures and building relationships with her new squadron mates. The 94th Fighter Squadron consisted of 24 pilots divided into 4 flights of 6 aircraft each. Most of the pilots were in their late 20s or early 30s, experienced officers who had proven themselves in previous assignments. The squadron's primary mission was air superiority, which meant they would be responsible for controlling the skies in any potential conflict. The F-22's advanced capabilities made it ideally suited for this role, but it also meant that the pilots needed to be prepared for the most challenging scenarios imaginable. Sarah's first few operational flights were supervised closely by Major Bradley, who proved to be a demanding but fair instructor. Unlike Captain Morrison, Bradley seemed genuinely interested in helping her succeed, though he didn't hesitate to point out areas where she needed improvement. "You're still thinking like you're in training," he told her after a particularly complex air-to-air exercise. "In combat, you won't have time to analyze every decision. You need to trust your instincts and act decisively. Hesitation will get you killed." The social dynamics of the squadron were complex and subtle. Most of the pilots were friendly enough on the surface, but Sarah could sense an underlying current of skepticism about her abilities. She was invited to squadron social events, but conversations often became stilted when she approached groups of pilots. She found herself eating lunch alone more often than not, reviewing mission materials or studying aircraft technical manuals. The squadron's informal leader was Captain Jake "Viper" Thompson, a charismatic pilot who had distinguished himself during deployments to the Middle East. He had a natural confidence that made other pilots gravitate toward him, and his opinions carried significant weight throughout the squadron. Unfortunately, he seemed to view Sarah's presence as a disruption to the unit's cohesion. "Nothing personal, Martinez," he said to her one day during a break between flights. "But this job requires a certain kind of person. It's not about being politically correct or meeting quotas. It's about who can handle the pressure when everything goes sideways." Sarah had heard variations of this speech before, but coming from someone as respected as Captain Thompson, it carried more weight. "I understand your concerns, sir," she replied carefully. "I'm hoping I'll have the opportunity to prove myself." Thompson smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, you'll get your chance. Count on it." That chance came sooner than Sarah expected. 2 months into her assignment, the squadron was tasked with a major training exercise involving multiple aircraft and complex scenarios designed to simulate real combat conditions. The exercise would last for 2 weeks and would involve coordination with other Air Force units, Navy aircraft, and even some Allied forces. Sarah was assigned to fly as wingman for Captain Thompson, a position that required absolute trust and seamless coordination. As his wingman, she would be responsible for protecting his aircraft while following his lead through whatever tactical situations they encountered. The first few days of the exercise went smoothly. Sarah demonstrated solid flying skills and good tactical awareness, successfully completing her assigned missions without major errors. But she could sense that Captain Thompson was still reserving judgment about her abilities. On the fourth day of the exercise, everything changed. The scenario involved a complex air-to-air engagement against simulated enemy fighters. Sarah and Captain Thompson were part of a four-ship formation tasked with establishing air superiority over a contested area. The enemy was represented by experienced pilots flying F-16s, configured to simulate foreign aircraft capabilities. The engagement began at high altitude, with both sides maneuvering for tactical advantage. Sarah maintained perfect formation position as Captain Thompson led their element through a series of aggressive turns designed to gain an advantageous firing position. The G-forces were intense, but Sarah's conditioning allowed her to maintain consciousness and situational awareness throughout the maneuvering. As they approached the merge point, where both formations would pass each other at high speed, Captain Thompson made a sudden tactical decision that caught everyone by surprise. Instead of maintaining his assigned altitude, he rolled inverted and dove toward the deck, forcing Sarah to follow him into what appeared to be a disadvantageous position. For a moment, Sarah thought he had made an error. The maneuver seemed to give up their altitude advantage and put them in a vulnerable position. But as the engagement developed, she realized that Captain Thompson had anticipated the enemy's tactics perfectly. His aggressive dive had put them in position for a devastating attack on the simulated enemy formation. The problem was that Sarah had hesitated for just a moment when he began the maneuver, uncertain whether he intended her to follow. That brief hesitation had opened up a gap between their aircraft that the enemy pilots were quick to exploit. "Break right!" Captain Thompson called over the radio as one of the aggressor aircraft maneuvered into a firing position on Sarah's F-22. Sarah yanked her aircraft into a hard right turn, feeling the G-forces slam her body against the seat. The world outside her canopy became a blur of sky and ground as she pulled nearly 9 Gs in an attempt to defeat the simulated missile shot. Her vision tunneled, and she fought to maintain consciousness as her aircraft screamed through the turn. The engagement simulator indicated that the enemy pilot had achieved a successful missile shot. In a real combat situation, Sarah would have been shot down. "Knockout 2 is dead," came the call from the exercise controller, using Sarah's call sign for the mission. The debriefing after the mission was brutal. Captain Thompson, Major Bradley, and several other pilots dissected every aspect of the engagement, analyzing what had gone right and what had gone wrong. When they got to Sarah's performance, the criticism was swift and merciless. "Martinez, you hesitated," Captain Thompson said bluntly. "When I called for the dive, you didn't react immediately. That hesitation opened up a gap that the enemy exploited. In combat, that kind of delay would have gotten both of us killed." Sarah felt her face burn with embarrassment. "Yes, sir, I understand." "Do you?" Major Bradley interjected. "Because this isn't the first time you've shown uncertainty during critical moments. Fighter aviation doesn't allow for second-guessing. You need to trust your flight lead and react instantly to tactical situations." The room fell silent as all eyes focused on Sarah. She could feel the weight of their collective judgment, the unspoken questions about whether she truly belonged in a fighter cockpit. "I'll do better, sir," she said quietly. "You'd better," Captain Thompson replied, "because next time we might not be fighting simulated enemies." That night, Sarah lay in her quarters staring at the ceiling, replaying the engagement over and over in her mind. She knew that her hesitation had been minimal, probably less than a second. But in the unforgiving world of air-to-air combat, even that brief delay was unacceptable. The worst part was that she understood Captain Thompson's tactical decision had been brilliant, but her momentary uncertainty had turned a potential victory into a defeat. The next morning brought a new challenge. Colonel Peterson called her into his office, his expression serious. "Lieutenant Martinez, I've been reviewing your performance reports," he began, settling behind his desk. "Your flying skills are adequate, but there are concerns about your tactical decision-making under pressure." Sarah felt her stomach clench. "Sir, yesterday's mission was just one example," Colonel Peterson interrupted. "Major Bradley has noted similar issues in previous exercises. The question is whether these are simply growing pains that will resolve with experience, or whether they represent fundamental limitations that will prevent you from being effective in this role." The implication was clear. Her position in the squadron was in jeopardy. "I'd like the opportunity to prove myself, sir," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Colonel Peterson leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "Very well, but understand that this is not a training environment where we can afford to give pilots unlimited opportunities to improve. This squadron has operational responsibilities, and every pilot needs to be capable of performing at the highest level from day one." As Sarah left the colonel's office, she felt the familiar burning sensation of determination mixed with desperation. She had come too far to fail now, but she was running out of opportunities to prove herself. The pressure was mounting, and she knew that one more significant mistake would likely end her career as a fighter pilot. The remaining days of the exercise passed in a blur of intense flying and constant evaluation. Sarah flew with mechanical precision, executing every maneuver flawlessly and responding to tactical situations with the instant decisiveness that her instructors demanded. But despite her improved performance, she could sense that some damage had been done to her reputation within the squadron. On the final day of the exercise, as she walked across the flight line after completing her last mission, Sarah overheard a conversation between two of her squadron mates that made her blood run cold. "I don't care how well she flies in training," one of them was saying. "When the pressure's on, she just doesn't have the killer instinct. Thompson was right about her from the beginning." "Maybe she should stick to transport aircraft," came the reply. "Flying fighters isn't just about technical skills. You need to have the mentality for it." Sarah quickened her pace, not wanting to hear any more. But the words echoed in her mind as she made her way back to the squadron building. The killer instinct. Was that what she was missing? Had all her technical proficiency and dedication been insufficient because she lacked some indefinable quality that separated true fighter pilots from everyone else? That evening, as she sat in her room reviewing the exercise results, Sarah came to a decision. She was tired of constantly having to prove herself, tired of being evaluated by different standards, tired of having her every mistake magnified while her successes were dismissed. If they wanted to see the killer instinct, she would show them exactly what she was capable of. The opportunity came the following week during a routine training mission. The mission briefing that Tuesday morning was routine. Sarah and 3 other pilots were scheduled for basic air-to-air training over the Atlantic, practicing intercept procedures and formation flying. It was the kind of mission that experienced pilots could fly in their sleep, designed more to maintain currency and proficiency than to challenge anyone's skills. Major Bradley led the briefing, covering weather conditions, radio frequencies, and safety procedures with the mechanical precision of someone who had given the same briefing hundreds of times. Sarah listened carefully, taking notes even though she could probably recite the procedures from memory. "Any questions?" Major Bradley asked as he concluded the briefing. No one raised their hand. It was a milk run, the kind of mission that pilots use to knock out required flying hours while staying sharp on basic skills. As they walked to the flight line, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of excitement and nervousness that always preceded a flight. Despite hundreds of hours in the F-22, she still felt a thrill when she saw the aircraft up close. The angular, predatory shape never failed to take her breath away, and the knowledge that she was qualified to fly one of the most advanced machines ever created still seemed almost surreal. Her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, was already performing the pre-flight inspection when she arrived at her aircraft. He was a 20-year veteran who took immense pride in maintaining his assigned F-22 in perfect condition. Every surface was spotless, every system had been checked and double-checked, and the aircraft gleamed in the morning sunlight. "She's ready to go, Lieutenant," Rodriguez said, handing her the maintenance log. "All systems green, fuel is topped off, and I've got you configured for air-to-air training." Sarah reviewed the log quickly, noting that all required inspections had been completed and no discrepancies were noted. "Thanks, Sergeant. Looks perfect as always." Rodriguez smiled with obvious pride. "Take care of her up there. She's a beautiful machine." The pre-flight inspection was a ritual that Sarah never rushed, despite having performed it countless times. She walked around the aircraft methodically, checking every surface, every access panel, every external system. The F-22 represented over $150 million of taxpayer money and cutting-edge technology, but more importantly, it was the machine that would keep her alive if something went wrong. As she climbed the ladder to the cockpit, Sarah felt the familiar transition from ground-based pilot to aviator. The cockpit of the F-22 was her second home, a place where she felt completely comfortable and in control. Every switch, every display, every control was positioned exactly where she expected it to be, and the advanced systems responded to her inputs with precision that bordered on the miraculous. The engine start sequence was smooth and uneventful. The twin Pratt & Whitney turbofan engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, quickly settling into the steady rumble of idle power. Sarah ran through her pre-taxi checklist, verifying that all systems were functioning normally and that her aircraft was ready for flight. "Knockout Flight Tower, ready for taxi," Major Bradley called over the radio. "Knockout Flight, taxi runway 27, altimeter 2997, came the reply from the control tower. The four F-22s taxied out to the runway in formation, their engines creating heat shimmer on the pavement behind them. Sarah was flying as number 3 in the formation, positioned on Major Bradley's left wing with another pilot filling out the foreship. The takeoff was spectacular, as it always was. The F-22's thrust-to-weight ratio allowed for incredibly short takeoff rolls and dramatic climb rates. Sarah felt herself pressed back into her seat as her aircraft accelerated down the runway, and then they were airborne, climbing rapidly into the clear Virginia sky. The training area was located over the Atlantic Ocean, about 50 miles east of the coast. It was a massive block of airspace reserved for military training, where pilots could practice combat maneuvers without worrying about civilian air traffic. As they climbed to their assigned altitude of 20,000 feet, Sarah enjoyed the view of the coastline receding behind them and the vast expanse of ocean stretching to the horizon. The first hour of the mission proceeded exactly according to plan. The 4 pilots practiced various intercept procedures, taking turns playing the role of target and interceptor. Sarah's performance was flawless, executing every maneuver with the precision and aggression that her instructors had demanded. She was beginning to feel confident that this mission would help restore her reputation within the squadron. Then Major Bradley called for a formation change that would put Captain Thompson in the lead, with Sarah as his wingman for the next series of exercises. "Knockout 3, you're with me," Captain Thompson called over the radio. "Let's see if you can keep up." There was something in his tone that immediately put Sarah on alert. This wasn't going to be a routine training exercise. Thompson led them into a series of increasingly aggressive maneuvers, pushing the aircraft and pilots to their limits. He rolled into vertical climbs that pressed Sarah deep into her seat, then transitioned into diving turns that created negative G-forces that lifted her against her restraint system. The pace was relentless, and Sarah found herself working harder than she had since her initial training. "Come on, Martinez," Thompson called over the radio during a particularly demanding sequence. "You're lagging behind. This is basic formation flying." Sarah gritted her teeth and tightened up her position. Accepting higher G-forces to maintain proper spacing, she could see Thompson watching her through his canopy, evaluating her every move. After 30 minutes of punishing formation work, Thompson called for a break. The aircraft leveled off at 25,000 feet, giving the pilots a chance to catch their breath and reset for the next portion of the mission. "Not bad, Martinez," Thompson said over the radio, though his tone suggested that "not bad" was far from a compliment. "But I want to see how you handle some real pressure. Let's try some 1-versus-1 air combat maneuvering." Air combat maneuvering, or ACM, was a test of pure piloting skill and tactical awareness. Two aircraft would engage in simulated combat, using their maneuverability and the pilot's skills to achieve an advantageous position for a simulated weapons shot. It was physically and mentally demanding, requiring split-second decisions and the ability to think in 3 dimensions while pulling extreme G-forces. "Roger," Sarah replied, though she felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. Thompson was one of the squadron's most experienced pilots, and he had never lost a 1-versus-1 engagement during her time in the unit. They set up the engagement with the aircraft separated by several miles, approaching each other head-on at high speed. The merge point, where they would pass each other and begin maneuvering, was critical. Each pilot would try to gain an immediate advantage through superior positioning or more aggressive maneuvering. "Fight's on!" Thompson called as they approached the merge. Sarah pulled her aircraft into a hard left turn, loading the airframe with over 7 Gs as she tried to get behind Thompson's F-22. But Thompson was ready for her move, rolling into an even more aggressive turn that maintained his position advantage. What followed was 5 minutes of the most intense flying Sarah had ever experienced. Both aircraft twisted and turned through the sky, each pilot trying to gain the split-second advantage needed for a weapons solution. Sarah found herself pulling G-forces that pushed her to the edge of consciousness, her vision tunneling and her body feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Thompson was relentless. Every time Sarah thought she had gained an advantage, he would counter with a move that put her back on the defensive. His experience showed in every maneuver, and Sarah began to realize that she was fighting a losing battle. "Come on, Martinez!" Thompson taunted over the radio as he maneuvered into a firing position behind her. "Where's that killer instinct everyone keeps talking about?" The comment hit Sarah like a physical blow. She realized that this wasn't just training. This was a test, and Thompson was determined to prove once and for all that she didn't belong in a fighter cockpit. Something snapped inside Sarah's mind. All the months of doubt, criticism, and subtle discrimination crystallized into a burning determination to prove herself once and for all. If Thompson wanted to see the killer instinct, she would show him exactly what she was capable of. Sarah rolled her aircraft inverted and pulled straight down, trading altitude for airspeed in a maneuver that surprised Thompson. As her aircraft accelerated toward the ocean below, she planned her next move with the calculating precision of a chess master. At 10,000 feet, she reversed her turn and pulled straight up, using her accumulated energy to climb rapidly back toward Thompson's altitude. The G-forces were crushing, but she maintained consciousness through sheer force of will. Thompson, caught off guard by her aggressive energy management, found himself in a disadvantageous position for the first time in the engagement. Sarah pressed her advantage ruthlessly, rolling and turning to stay behind his aircraft as he desperately tried to escape. "Guns! Guns! Guns!" Sarah called over the radio, indicating that she had achieved a successful simulated weapons shot. The engagement was over. Sarah had won. The radio was silent for several seconds before Thompson acknowledged the result. "Good kill, Martinez," he said, and Sarah could hear the surprise in his voice. But Sarah wasn't finished. The rush of victory, combined with months of pent-up frustration, had triggered something primal in her psyche. She wanted to make a statement that no one could ignore or dismiss. "Knockout lead. This is 3, she called to Major Bradley. "Request permission to demonstrate advanced maneuvering capabilities." "-3, Bradley replied immediately. "We're returning to base. Form up for recovery." Sarah looked down at Langley Air Force Base, visible in the distance below them. The runway was clearly visible, along with the squadron buildings where her doubters were probably monitoring the radio frequency. This was her moment. Instead of responding to Bradley's order, Sarah rolled her F-22 into a steep dive toward the base. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly as she descended, and she could hear increasingly urgent calls over the radio for her to respond and return to formation. At 5,000 feet above the base, Sarah pulled back hard on the stick, converting her airspeed into a vertical climb that sent her F-22 rocketing skyward. The G-forces were tremendous, but she maintained consciousness through technique and determination. At the top of the climb, she rolled the aircraft inverted and pulled through into a perfect loop, the base spread out below her like a miniature model. Martinez returned to formation immediately. Major Bradley's voice crackled over the radio, but Sarah was beyond caring about orders or consequences. She completed the first loop and immediately transitioned into a second one, then a third. Each loop was perfectly executed, a demonstration of both her flying skills and the incredible capabilities of the F-22. The aircraft responded to her inputs flawlessly, tracing perfect circles in the sky above Langley Air Force Base. Below on the base, every activity had stopped as personnel came out of buildings to watch the incredible display. The loops were being performed with a precision and aggression that few pilots could match, and everyone watching knew that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Sarah completed her fifth loop and rolled out, finally responding to the increasingly frantic calls from Major Bradley to return to formation. As she rejoined the other aircraft, she felt a strange sense of calm descend over her. She had made her statement, and now she would face whatever consequences followed. The landing was silent, with no radio chatter beyond the necessary communications with the control tower. Sarah taxied her aircraft to its parking spot, shut down the engines, and climbed out of the cockpit with legs that were still shaking from adrenaline. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was waiting for her with an expression that mixed admiration with concern. "Hell of a display, Lieutenant," he said quietly, "but I think you might be in some trouble." Sarah nodded, accepting the maintenance log mechanically. "Probably." Colonel Peterson was waiting for her in the squadron building, his face a mask of controlled fury. Behind him stood Major Bradley and Captain Thompson, both looking like they had witnessed something that challenged their fundamental understanding of the world. "Lieutenant Martinez, in my office. Now," Colonel Peterson said through clenched teeth. As Sarah walked toward the colonel's office, she passed through the squadron's main room where other pilots were gathered around the windows, still talking about what they had witnessed. The conversation stopped as she passed, and she could feel their eyes following her. "That was either the most brilliant thing I've ever seen or the most career-ending," one of the pilots said quietly. "Maybe both," came the reply. In the colonel's office, Sarah stood at attention while Colonel Peterson closed the door and moved behind his desk. His face was red with anger, and she could see a vein pulsing in his temple. "Lieutenant Martinez," he began, his voice dangerously quiet, "what you just did was a direct violation of orders, a breach of airspace regulations, and the most spectacular display of insubordination I have ever witnessed in 25 years of military service." Sarah remained silent, knowing that anything she said would only make the situation worse. "You endangered your aircraft, violated multiple safety regulations, and turned a routine training mission into an unauthorized air show," Colonel Peterson continued, his voice rising. "The only reason you're not under arrest right now is that your flying was so technically perfect that even I can't find a safety violation to charge you with." The colonel sat down heavily in his chair, studying Sarah with a mixture of anger and grudging respect. "However," he said after a long pause, "I have never seen flying like that from any pilot in this squadron. Those loops were flawless. executed with a precision and confidence that demonstrated complete mastery of both the aircraft and advanced aerobatic techniques. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. "The question now," Colonel Peterson continued, "is what to do with a pilot who has the skills of a test pilot, but the judgment of a teenager. Any suggestions, Lieutenant?" For the first time since the engagement began, Sarah spoke. "Sir, I know I violated orders and regulations. I accept full responsibility for my actions, but I also know that I just proved something that needed to be proved." "And what exactly did you prove?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "That I have the killer instinct, sir, and that I can fly an F-22 better than anyone who doubts whether I belong here." Colonel Peterson was quiet for a long moment. His fingers drummed on his desk as he considered her words. "Lieutenant Martinez," he finally said, "what you displayed today was not killer instinct. It was something much rarer and more valuable. You showed that under extreme pressure you can make split-second decisions and execute them flawlessly. That's not just piloting skill. That's combat leadership." Sarah felt her heart racing as she waited for his next words. "However, your methods were completely unacceptable, and there will be consequences. You'll be grounded for 2 weeks while we conduct a formal investigation of today's incident. But when you return to flying status, you'll do so as my new assistant flight commander." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. Assistant flight commander was a position of significant responsibility, typically reserved for the squadron's most trusted pilots. "Sir, I don't understand." Colonel Peterson smiled for the first time since she had entered his office. "Lieutenant Martinez, any pilot can follow orders and fly by the book, but combat requires leaders who can think independently and act decisively when everything goes wrong. What you did today was reckless and insubordinate, but it also demonstrated exactly the kind of aggressive confidence that we need in our pilots." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the flight line where Sarah's F-22 was being secured by the ground crew. "From now on, anyone who questions whether you have what it takes to fly fighters will have to answer to me personally. You've proven beyond any doubt that you belong in this cockpit." As Sarah left the colonel's office, she felt like a different person than the one who had walked in. The 2 weeks of grounding would be difficult, but she knew that when she returned to flying, it would be with the respect and confidence of her squadron mates. Word of her aerial display spread quickly throughout the base and beyond. Within days, pilots from other squadrons were stopping by to hear the story firsthand. The loops above Langley became legendary, talked about in ready rooms and officer clubs across the Air Force. Captain Thompson approached her 3 days later in the dining facility, sitting down across from her without invitation. "Martinez," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Sarah looked up from her meal, surprised. "I spent months trying to prove that you didn't belong here," Thompson continued. "I was wrong. What you did up there, that was some of the most impressive flying I've ever seen. More importantly, it took guts to make that statement when your career was on the line." He extended his hand across the table. "I'd be honored to fly as your wingman any time." Sarah shook his hand, feeling like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. When she returned to flying status 2 weeks later, everything was different. Her squadron mates treated her with a respect that had been absent before. Her opinions were sought out during mission planning. Her flying was praised rather than criticized. Most importantly, Sarah felt different about herself. She no longer felt like she had to prove her worthiness every day. The loops above Langley had been her declaration of independence from the doubters and critics. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Years later, when young female pilots asked her about overcoming obstacles and proving themselves in a male-dominated field, Sarah would always tell them the same thing. Sometimes you have to be willing to risk everything to show the world who you really are. And sometimes, the most important person you need to convince is yourself.